And then I might add, Saturday night, the second segment comes on. So with you tonight and tomorrow night and Saturday night.
For 5 seasons, America watched Chuck Connors raise his rifle and stand for everything decent and righteous on the Rifleman. However, the man the whole country trusted to protect the innocent was carrying secrets that never made it to the screen. What was really behind the legend is a story far more complicated than anyone knew. Now, you are about to find out. Body, the Brooklyn boy built like a legend. There are men who seem to have been constructed specifically for a purpose. Every physical detail pointing in the same direction. Every early experience building toward the same destination. Chuck Connors was that kind of man. 6 feet 5 inches of Brooklyn-bred bone and muscle, with blue eyes that could silence a room from across it, and a voice that arrived before he did and lingered after he left. He did not walk into spaces so much as he occupied them. And from the very beginning, from the sandlots of Bay Ridge to the professional courts and diamonds of 2 major American sports, everything about him announced that he was built for something larger than ordinary life. The world that made him was not a gentle one. Kevin Joseph Aloysius Connors was born on April 10, 1921, in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn, New York, to Irish immigrant parents who had come over from Newfoundland, carrying nothing but their faith, their work ethic, and the particular stubbornness of people who have survived enough hardship to stop being surprised by it. His father, Alban, worked the local docks as a longshoreman. His mother, Marcella, kept the household together with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that survival was not a dramatic act, but a daily one. He had one younger sister, Gloria, who would later describe her brother in a single word that said more than a paragraph could. She called him a womanizer, but that came later. In the beginning, he was simply a boy who could throw harder, run faster, and hit farther than anyone around him. He served as an altar boy at the Basilica of Our Lady of Perpetual Help in Bay Ridge. He played sandlot baseball before he had proper equipment to play it with. He joined the Bay Ridge Boys Club and absorbed the particular education that Depression-era Brooklyn offered boys who were willing to pay attention. That education was not academic. It was physical and competitive and deeply practical. It taught him that talent without discipline was just noise, and that the only things worth having were the things you worked hard enough to deserve. The talent earned him an athletic scholarship to Adelphi Academy, a private high school that opened doors his family's finances never could have. From there, he went to Seton Hall College in South Orange, New Jersey, on a baseball scholarship, where he played first base with the kind of natural authority that made coaches stop what they were doing and watch. His teammates started calling him Chuck, because he was always calling out to his infielders at first base, always saying, "Chuck it to me, chuck it to me," and the nickname displaced his given name so completely that Kevin Connors essentially ceased to exist. Chuck Connors was who he became. Chuck Connors was who he stayed. He left Seton Hall in 1942 to serve in the United States Army during World War II, where he was stationed as a tank instructor. The war did what war does to young men. It interrupted everything and accelerated everything simultaneously. It took years from him, and gave him a seriousness and a set of shoulders that he carried for the rest of his life. When he came home, he went back to baseball. And then something happened that placed him in a category almost no one else in the history of American professional sports has ever occupied. He played in the NBA. In the 1946-47 season, Chuck Connors suited up for the Boston Celtics. He was one of the earliest players in the league's history, and one of the very few human beings ever to compete at the highest professional level in both basketball and baseball. He is one of only 13 athletes in the history of American professional sports to have achieved that distinction, a list that includes Danny Ainge, Dave DeBusschere, and Gene Conley. He also holds a distinction that belongs to him alone. He is the only player in NBA history to have shattered a backboard during practice. Not cracked it, shattered it. That detail tells you everything you need to know about the physical force the man carried in his body. He left the Celtics in early 1947 to go to spring training with the Brooklyn Dodgers, the team he had dreamed about since childhood. The major league career that followed was modest by box score standards. He appeared for the Dodgers in 1949 and for the Chicago Cubs in 1951. accumulating 2 home runs and a batting average that suggested his future lay somewhere other than the diamond. But the achievement was real, regardless of the statistics. He had made it. The boy from Bay Ridge had stood in the same infield as the players he had grown up idolizing. His gravestone would eventually carry the logos of the Celtics, the Dodgers, and the Cubs together, a permanent record of a sporting life that deserved to be remembered on its own terms long before Hollywood entered the picture. The pivot to acting came the way the best pivots do, not from a plan, but from a moment. A casting director spotted him at a baseball game in 1952 and saw something in that enormous frame and those blue eyes that a baseball diamond was not fully using. He was offered a small role in the Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn comedy, Pat and Mike, and he took it with the same directness he had applied to every other challenge in his life. He showed up. He did the work. He was almost immediately undeniable on screen. The camera found him the way cameras find certain people. Not because they are performing, but because they are simply, completely unavoidably present. He was 31 years old. He had already lived 3 careers worth of experience, and the one that would define him for generations had not even begun. Lucas McCain and the character that swallowed him whole. The road to the Rifleman was not a straight one. It was built from small roles and borrowed momentum, and one act of generosity from a bigger star that Chuck Connors never forgot for the rest of his life. In 1953, he was standing outside an audition for the film South Sea Woman when Burt Lancaster walked up and asked him what he was doing there. When Connors told him he was auditioning, Lancaster did not wish him luck and walk away. He stayed. He ran lines with him. He coached him through the material with the patience of a man who understood exactly what it felt like to be on the outside of something looking in. Connors got the part. He gave Lancaster every ounce of credit for it and continued giving him that credit decades later. Long after both of their careers had reached heights, neither man could have imagined standing outside that audition. The film roles accumulated steadily through the middle 1950s. He appeared alongside Gregory Peck and Gene Simmons in The Big Country. He worked with Doris Day. He appeared in Old Yeller, the 1957 Walt Disney film that made an entire generation of American children cry and introduced Connors to the family audience that would shortly define his career. He was building something recognizable, a presence, a type. The tall, straight-backed, morally unambiguous man who could be trusted to do the right thing when the moment demanded it. Hollywood was paying attention. Then came 1958, and a role he almost walked away from before it changed everything. The Rifleman was built around a concept that was genuinely unusual for its time. Lucas McCain was not a lawman or a gunslinger or a wandering hero without attachments. He was a father, a widowed rancher in the New Mexico territory raising his young son Mark alone, using a custom-modified Winchester rifle to protect his town and his boy from the violence that the frontier delivered without apology. The show asked its audience to watch a man be strong and tender at the same time, to believe that the same hands that could fire a rifle faster than any man alive could also hold a child through a nightmare. Chuck Connors made that believable every single week for 5 seasons. He had initially refused the role over the salary being offered. The numbers did not match what he believed the commitment deserved. He only agreed after the producers came back with a raise and something more significant than money, a partial ownership stake in the series itself. That negotiation, conducted quietly before a single frame was filmed, would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions of his professional life. He was not just the star of The Rifleman, he was a stakeholder in it, and that distinction mattered enormously when the show became a phenomenon. The Rifleman ran from 1958 to 1963, producing 168 episodes across 5 seasons on ABC. It was one of the most watched programs in America during its run, and it made Lucas McCain one of the most recognized characters in the history of the medium. Fathers watched it and felt something. Sons watched it and understood something about what a man was supposed to be. The show worked because the character worked, and the character worked because Chuck Connors brought something to it that no amount of scripting could manufacture. He brought physical authority and genuine emotional warmth in equal measure, and the combination was simply irresistible. But here's the thing about playing the perfect father on television for 5 years. The audience does not separate the performance from the performer. They cannot. The trust they place in Lucas McCain, they also place in Chuck Connors. The integrity they see in the character, they assume lives in the man. And when the camera stopped rolling and the rifle went back into its case and Chuck Connors drove home to his actual life, the distance between what the audience believed and what was true began to quietly, steadily grow. The secrets were already accumulating. Nobody was looking for them yet. The secrets behind the rifle. There is a particular cruelty in the gap between image and reality. Not the cruelty of exposure or scandal, but the quieter cruelty of a man spending decades being loved for something he was not entirely. Every time an audience member looked at Lucas McCain and saw the father they wished they had, Chuck Connors was somewhere off screen, living a life that told a different story. Not a villainous one, not a story of pure darkness or deliberate deception. Simply the story of a complicated man who happened to be extraordinarily good at portraying an uncomplicated one. Complications began at home. His first marriage was to Elizabeth Jane Riddell, a union that started in 1948, when Chuck Connors was a minor league baseball player with no particular reason to believe he would ever be famous. They built a life together through the lean years, through the athletic career winding down, and the acting career slowly winding up, through the early Hollywood roles and the gathering momentum that preceded The Rifleman. They had 4 sons together: Michael, Jeffrey, Stephen, and Kevin. A full house, a family portrait that looked, from the outside, exactly like the one he was delivering to America every week on ABC. Jeffrey even appeared on The Rifleman set in 1959, playing alongside his father on the very show that was making the Connors name synonymous with devoted parenthood. The symmetry was perfect, too perfect as it turned out. The marriage ended in 1961, 1 year before The Rifleman aired its final season. The reason given in most accounts was infidelity. Chuck Connors, the man America trusted to model what a good father looked like, had not managed to model what a faithful husband looked like behind the camera. His own sister, Gloria, in the biography written about him after his death, reached for a single word to describe her brother in his personal life. She called him a womanizer. Not with malice, not with the relish of someone settling a score, but with the matter-of-fact plainness of a woman who had watched her brother closely for a lifetime and saw no point in pretending she had not. That word sat in the historical record quietly for years, noticed by those who went looking and ignored by those who preferred the version of Chuck Connors that came with a Winchester and a moral code. The second marriage arrived quickly. In 1963, the same year The Rifleman ended, he married Kamala Devi, an actress of Indian heritage whom he had met on the set of the film Geronimo. She was born in Mumbai, had built a career in both Indian and American film, and brought to the relationship an intelligence and a cultural background that was genuinely unusual for a Hollywood pairing of that era. They appeared together on screen multiple times across the 1960s, sharing chemistry that translated naturally from the set to their personal life. The marriage lasted nearly a decade, which by Hollywood standards represented something close to durability. It ended in 1972 under circumstances that went beyond the standard incompatibility narrative. Rumors of domestic abuse surfaced in accounts written after the fact. Claims that painted a portrait of a man whose physical power, so celebrated on screen and on the sports field, had found darker expression behind closed doors. These were rumors, not court findings or confirmed testimony, and they should be treated with the appropriate weight of that distinction. But they existed, they circulated, and they added a dimension to the Chuck Connors story that the Lucas McCain mythology had left no room for. The third marriage was briefer and stranger in its own way. Faith Quabius was an actress he met on the set of Soylent Green, a woman born in 1940 who was described in various accounts as a former Playboy bunny alongside her acting credits. They began their relationship on set, took 4 years before formalizing it, and married in 1977. The marriage lasted 2 years. By 1979, it was over, leaving Chuck Connors with 3 dissolved marriages, 4 sons from the first, and a private life that had generated considerably more wreckage than his public image suggested was possible. What he had instead of a 4th marriage was Rosemary Grumley. She was his personal secretary, a title that in Hollywood has always covered a range of arrangements that formal titles were never designed to describe. In his biography, she was referred to as his companion, a word chosen carefully and left deliberately undefined. She was present through the final chapter of his life, in a way that wives had not managed to sustain. She was there through the professional years after the Rifleman, through the smaller roles and the television appearances, and the gradual recalibration of a career that could not fully escape the gravity of one iconic character. She was there through the lung cancer diagnosis. She was there at the end. Who she was to him beyond the formal title was a question the biography raised and declined to answer, which, in its own way, was the most honest thing it could have done. Then there was the politics. Chuck Connors occupied a position in Hollywood that made him almost as unusual off-screen as his athletic career had made him in the sporting world. He was a committed, vocal, unapologetic conservative in an industry that has never been comfortable with that alignment. He supported Richard Nixon openly when Nixon was elected president in 1968. He supported Ronald Reagan from the governor's mansion in California all the way to the White House. He did not perform these beliefs for the cameras or soften them for industry dinners. He held them the way he held everything, with the full weight of his convictions and no particular interest in the approval of the room. That cost him. Not catastrophically, not in the way that destroyed careers, but in the accumulation of small exclusions and cooled relationships and doors that did not open as readily as they might have. Hollywood has always had an unofficial consensus about what its leading men are supposed to believe, and Chuck Connors spent 4 decades declining to believe it. The man who played the moral anchor of the American frontier on screen was considered, in certain circles, to be on the wrong side of the moral arguments happening often. He did not adjust. He did not apologize. He absorbed whatever the position cost him, and continued. That stubbornness was perhaps the most consistent thing about him. The same quality that had driven a dock worker's son from Bay Ridge to the NBA and the major leagues and the Hollywood Walk of Fame was the quality that made him incapable of performing beliefs he did not hold, or hiding the man he actually was behind a more comfortable public version. He could play Lucas McCain with total conviction because Lucas McCain was a man who stood for something regardless of the cost. The irony is that in his private life, for all its contradictions and failures and unanswered questions, Chuck Connors was doing exactly the same thing, standing for something, regardless of the cost. Even when the something he was standing for made the people around him deeply uncomfortable. The secrets were never really hidden. They were simply waiting for someone to look at the full man, rather than just the rifle.
The Shadow of Lucas McCain. When The Rifleman aired its final episode in 1963, Chuck Connors walked off that set and into a career question that would follow him for the next 3 decades. The question was simple and entirely without a satisfying answer.
How do you follow a character that the entire country has decided belongs to you permanently? Lucas McCain was not just a role, he was a cultural landmark. He was the image of American fatherhood that an entire generation had grown up watching every week. And the audience that loved him had no particular interest in letting Chuck Connors be anyone else. He tried anyway. He tried with the persistence and the physical determination that had carried him from the sandlots of Brooklyn to the Boston Celtics to the major leagues to a Hollywood Walk of Fame star. And he accumulated a body of post-Rifleman work that by any objective measure represented a successful and varied career. More than 50 films, dozens of television appearances spanning 4 decades. Roles that stretched his range in directions that Lucas McCain had never permitted and that the audience had never asked for. But the shadow moved with him everywhere he went. The 1960s and 70s brought a string of westerns and action pictures that kept him in the genre his audience expected, while giving him room to operate at the edges of it. He worked continuously, and he worked hard. The same work ethic that had defined every previous chapter of his life showing up intact on every set he walked onto. Directors who worked with him spoke consistently about his professionalism, his preparation, and the way he carried the physical authority of a much younger man well into his middle years. He was not coasting on the Rifleman legacy. He was working against it, one role at a time, trying to establish that the man was larger than the character. Then came 1977 and the role that came closest to breaking the image entirely. Roots was not just a television event, it was a cultural earthquake. Alex Haley's saga of an African-American family traced across generations of slavery and survival reached an audience of over 100 million Americans across 8 consecutive nights in January of that year, becoming one of the most watched broadcasts in the history of the medium. The casting was deliberate, and the performances were expected to carry the full weight of a history that American television had never confronted so directly or so honestly. Chuck Connors was cast as a plantation owner, a man who enslaved human beings, who treated people as property, who embodied the particular moral catastrophe at the center of the story with a coldness that the role demanded and the audience needed to believe. It was the most deliberately counter-programmed casting decision of his career. The man America trusted above almost all others to protect the innocent was placed on the side of those who destroyed innocence systematically and without remorse. He did not flinch. He delivered a performance so committed and so stripped of the warmth that had made Lucas McCain beloved that the Emmy nomination it earned him felt not just deserved, but necessary. The Academy was acknowledging something important, that Chuck Connors had been more than one thing all along, that beneath the rifle and the rancher's code and the patient fatherly wisdom, there was an actor capable of genuine darkness, and that the darkness was convincing precisely because the contrast with everything his audience knew about him was so complete. The Roots performance did not redefine his career the way a younger man's equivalent risk might have. He was 56 years old when it aired, and the industry's appetite for redefining a man of that age on its own terms was limited. But it permanently complicated the simple story. It made the legacy richer and more honest and harder to reduce to a single image of a tall man on a New Mexico street with a Winchester in his hands and a boy at his side. The 1980s brought further television work and the kind of recognition that arrives when an industry decides to formally acknowledge what it owes someone. In 1984, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame at 6838 Hollywood Boulevard, honoring 4 decades of screen work that had touched almost every genre the medium offered. He accepted it with the directness that characterized everything he did publicly, without excessive sentiment and without false modesty, the way a man accepts something he worked for rather than something he was given. In 1991, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Western Performers at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City, taking his place among the actors and figures whose work had defined the Western as an American art form. That same year, he returned to the role that had started everything. The 1991 television film brought Lucas McCain back to the screen for one final appearance. Connors was 70 years old. The character he had first played at 37 had aged with him in ways that the original audience could feel immediately and completely. It was not a triumphant comeback so much as a farewell. A last conversation between a performer and the creation that had defined him, conducted in front of the audience that had never let either of them go. He was diagnosed with lung cancer shortly afterward. A lifetime of smoking had accumulated a debt that his body finally presented for payment in the last year of his life. He was hospitalized with pneumonia 3 weeks before the end. He died on November 10, 1992, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles at the age of 71. The funeral brought together the people who had known the athlete, the actor, the political conservative, the complicated husband, the devoted father, the loyal friend. Rosemary Grumley was there. His sons were there. The industry that had given him everything and taken from him the thing he could never quite escape was there. And somewhere in the back of every mind in that room was a tall man on a dusty street, rifle in hand, son at his side, standing for something the real man had always found harder to sustain than the character made it look. The full man, finally. There is a particular kind of American story that gets told cleanly because the audience needs it to be clean. The hero is heroic. The father is devoted. The man with the rifle stands for justice and never wavers and never contradicts the image he projects onto the screen every week. That story is easier to carry through a lifetime than the complicated one. It requires less explanation and generates less discomfort and sits more neatly inside the mythology that popular culture builds around the people it decides to love. Chuck Connors never quite fit inside that clean story. Not entirely, not if you looked closely enough and honestly enough at all the evidence the life actually left behind. He was born into nothing and built everything from the body and the will he arrived with. That part is clean and it is true, and it deserves every ounce of admiration it has always received. A longshoreman's son from Bay Ridge who earned his way onto a professional basketball court and a Major League Baseball diamond through sheer physical gifts. and the kind of competitive hunger that Brooklyn instilled in boys who grew up watching their fathers work themselves hollow for wardies that barely covered the rent. That origin story is genuinely remarkable, and it would have been remarkable enough on its own without everything that came after. But everything that came after arrived anyway. The acting career that began by accident and became a 40-year commitment, the role that made him immortal, and the 3 decades he spent trying to be more than it. The marriages that started with promise and ended with a particular damage that a man of his appetites and restlessness tended to leave behind. The political convictions held loudly in rooms that did not want to hear them. The companion who was never named as anything more than a companion, and who stayed until the very end. His sister Gloria described him as a womanizer, and the biography moved on as though the word had been adequately addressed by simply being written down. It had not been adequately addressed. It pointed at something real about the distance between the character and the man, between the patience and tenderness that made Lucas McCain the father every child in America wished they had, and the restlessness that made Chuck Connors someone his own sons experienced very differently than the television audience did. The political dimension added a layer of complexity that his era never fully processed. In an industry that ran liberal and expected its stars to run with it, Chuck Connors planted his flag on the opposite hill and refused to move it regardless of the social cost. His support for Richard Nixon was not a quiet private preference. His backing of Ronald Reagan was not something he kept to the privacy of the voting booth. He said what he believed in the rooms where saying it was most uncomfortable, and he paid whatever price that required without complaint. That stubbornness runs through every chapter of his story as the single most consistent thread, the boy who earned his way out of Brooklyn through athletic persistence. The athlete who refused to accept that baseball was finished with him until the numbers made denial impossible. The actor who negotiated a partial ownership stake in the Rifleman, rather than simply accepting the salary offered. The man who kept his politics intact in an industry that punished him socially for them. He was not easy. He was not simple. He was not the man on the screen. But here is what he also was. His son Jeffrey appeared alongside him on the Rifleman set as early as 1959, working in the industry his father had opened a door into. The Chuck Connors Charitable Foundation organized annual golf tournaments raising money for the Angel View Crippled Children's Foundation, year after year, with the consistency of a man who understood that generosity was not a gesture, but a practice. That is not the behavior of a man who only performed virtue for the camera. It is the behavior of a man who contained both the virtue and the contradictions simultaneously, and never fully resolved the tension between them. The Roots performance in 1977 remains the most honest thing his career produced. He put Lucas McCain's face on a monster and held it there for 8 nights while over 100 million Americans watched and felt the discomfort of recognizing that the face of decency and the face of cruelty are not always different faces. The Emmy nomination confirmed that the performance landed. The discomfort it generated in his existing audience confirmed that it was necessary. His gravestone at San Fernando Mission Cemetery does not carry a rifle. It does not reference the Rifleman or Lucas McCain. It carries the logos of the Boston Celtics, the Chicago Cubs, and the Brooklyn Dodgers. He chose to be remembered first as the athlete. The boy from Brooklyn who made it to the professional level in 2 different sports through nothing but talent and determination. Everything else, the fame, the character, the complicated private history, came after that foundation and rested on top of it. That choice says something important. It says that underneath the television legend and the Hollywood star, there was still a kid from Bay Ridge who needed the world to know that he had done something real before anyone was watching, that the achievement was his own before it belonged to a character, that the man existed before the myth and would still exist after it. Chuck Connors performed virtue for millions of weekly viewers and lived something considerably messier in the hours the camera did not cover. He held his convictions in rooms that rejected them, and his generosity in practice long after the spotlight moved on. He was not Lucas McCain. He was considerably more interesting than that. And now, finally, the full man stands in the light. Chuck Connors gave America a hero and kept the complicated man behind the hero almost entirely to himself. Now, the full story has finally been told. If this one stayed with you, hit subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments. There are more stories like this one on the way.